a change in our plans. We had plans for having Steve Roberts with us, and I remember well, and some of you were here with us at the last lecture when Paige Sawyer was here, and at the end I was building up that Steve Roberts was going to be able to be here. That was on Tuesday, September 17th, and I walked out of here to hear the sad news that Koki had passed away. And Steve, who was going to come and speak, Steve is a professor at George Washington University, contributing editor to U.S. News and World Report, just wonderful credentials, and the husband of Koki Roberts. And about 2 weeks ago, we waited a little while and then got in communication with Steve, spoke with him via email back and forth. It was a wonderful conversation, appreciated his heart, and wanted to give as many options as possible. And his comment was that at present the family is pretty much staying there in the Washington, D.C. area and will not be doing traveling apart from perhaps a weekend or two visits down here. But for the present they're staying up there, and if he could beg off and perhaps another time. But he sent a message, and I wanted to share it with you because I think it's so very, very appropriate this day, where he says, "Our family has been deeply touched by the outpouring of love and support we've received from so many of you. It's been overwhelming and inspiring at the same time, and I want you to know how truly grateful I am. I ask only one thing, that you keep Koki's spirit alive in your own life by helping others in need and cherishing your loved ones every day in every way you can." That's really beautiful, and I wanted to share that with you to understand what is our commitment as well. Well, with Steve unavailable, we are very pleased today to celebrate Koki's life and to honor Steve by having a very good friend of both of them here as a speaker, and that is Lee Brockington. And there was a cheer. And just so very, very glad. Lee is coordinator of public, I like the new title, coordinator of public engagement. There could not be a better phrase to describe Lee Brockington, public engagement. At Hobcall, resident of Pawleys Island for 35 years, graduate of Columbia College in Public Affairs, Public Relations. Met somebody a couple weeks ago who was at school with you. Oh, the stories I heard. Great friend of the Friends of the Georgetown Library, a very good friend of mine. And just really pleased to have her here today to share about the project that she and Steve did together. And that project is this book, that book. And it's just a wonderful book on the history, the people, the persons, the places of Pawleys Island. Please join me in welcoming Lee Brockington.
He's great at what he does. We're grateful for Bob and Carol. Behind every good man, there's a good woman.
Absolutely.
And I'm grateful. I'm grateful that that today my calendar was free. And when Bob called, I was able to say yes, of course, that there was no conflict. For all of us who live here or visit here, I think we agree that we all live blessed lives. I had vacationed at Pawleys since age 10, and at age 24 began working at Hobcall Barony and living on the north end of Pawleys Island. $150 a month. Woo! I didn't know if I could afford it or not, but I managed. I lived right across the street from Frank and Faye Marlowe, whose store on Highway 17, Marlowe's store, and now the famous Frank's Restaurant, named for Frank Marlowe, was the meeting place. I was blessed to meet interesting people right away through Marlowe's store and through Pawleys Island Apothecary and the Pawleys Island Post Office, a small town with year-round families, and then the atmosphere of perennial summer visitors made me very happy. Coupled with my work at Hobcall Barony, when I was at work, I didn't want to go home. And when I was at home, I didn't want to go to work. At Hobcall, too, I met interesting scientists and historians. I once met Winston Churchill's granddaughter. About 2 years later, I met Winston Churchill's grandson. E.F. Hutton's family came for a tour not too long ago. And also, I especially enjoyed meeting retired plantation managers and slave descendants, cooks, housekeepers, nurses, and teachers. I began to realize that while the histories of plantation owners and Georgetown businessmen had been recorded, much of Pawleys Island history was still oral history, passed down through generations of family. In 1984, I began to write down what I was learning in conversations, clipping newspaper articles. I'm an inveterate clipper, but my mother taught me to date every clipping I cut. And then I began writing tour scripts, brochures, press releases, and then a weekly column for the Georgetown Times. In 2003, the Pawleys Island Civic Association first wanted to capture the oral histories of longtime Pawleys Island vacationers and asked me to help them create a book called Pawleys Island Stories from the Porch, a blue book with a rocking chair on the front. I brought it and I'm holding it up for you to see. It's the second book the Pawleys Island Civic Association had done, and the oral histories spanning about 100 years. The Civic Association president then, Linwood Altman, wanted me to help create a book a few years later with 850 photographs that he collected. And in 2008, Pawleys Island, A Century of History and Photographs was published. And it was through that project that I met Cokie and Steve Roberts, because we asked them to do the foreword for the book. We asked Cokie, actually, if she would write a foreword to Pawleys Island, A Century of History and Photographs, and she said yes, but may I do it with my husband, Steve? We both love Pawleys Island so much. And I wanted to start this lecture with an excerpt from what they wrote together for the Pawleys Island, A Century of History and Photographs, that was published in 2008. Cokie and Steve Roberts write, "When we first came to Pawleys Island 30 years ago, our kids were 8 and 10. We'd watch them dash through the surf or dig in the sand and say to ourselves, someday we'll have a dream house on the north end. And last Easter, all 6 of our grandchildren spent the holiday with us. The days were cool and breezy, but the children flew kites and built forts. They tossed footballs and bocce balls and competed in a ferocious Easter egg hunt worthy of highlights on Sports Center. Later, one child asked his mother, can we live here at Pawleys and go to the beach every day? Think about how many of you said the same thing. See, we realize that we are now, for the first time in 2008, fully part of the Pawleys community. People now write in our guest book. We don't write in theirs. We care about the newly planted sea oats rooting in to hold down the dunes. We care about the dredge in the creek pumping out mud and sand to make the channel deeper. It's our creek, not their creek. It's our beach, not just their beach. But the most telling rituals on Pawleys Island take place every day in every house, on every spot of sand. Not long after we started coming here, Steve wrote a piece for the New York Times that included this passage. I particularly love to walk the Pawleys beach in the late afternoon, where tiny brown water birds race to the surf for food and then scurry away from the next wave. Teenage girls, taller and more colorful than the shorebirds, twitter together as they walk, then bend over on their gangly legs, poking the sand for shells. One of our own trophies, a conch, a whelk, a conch, turned out to still be occupied and crawled halfway across the room in which we had left it. Fishermen, 6-packs nestling in icy coolers, cast their lines and cares into the surf. A grandmother dips a baby into the waves in a baptismal ritual. A boy grabs a dead crab and shakes it menacingly at a terrified younger sibling. We like to think that those gangly girls, and perhaps even that boy with the crab, are now dipping babies of their own in the waves. Pawleys is sea and sand and surf, but it is also the South. For us, part of the lure has always been geography. Cokie is a native of New Orleans and has deep roots in the region. Her mother's family, the Claibornes, can trace their origins in America to Jamestown. And one of her ancestors, W.C.C. Claiborne, was the first governor of the Louisiana Territory. So coming to Pawleys was like coming home, and one southern trait that pervades this island is neighborliness. Even if we've been away for months, the checkout ladies at the grocery store up the road recognize us and ask, "How your grandkids doing?" After we bought our house, both sets of neighbors brought us presents, a book of local history from one neighbor and a set of cocktail tools from the other. And we turned to each other and said, "Yes, we're in the South, we're in the South." And when we first started coming here, we made friends with Doc Lashcott, the man who made the Pawleys Island hammock famous, and he taught us the fine art of flounder fishing. After one successful outing with Doc, we cooked our catch just hours later, and the fish was so fresh it was intoxicating. Perhaps a good white wine fueled our feeling of euphoria, but that flounder remains on our top 10 list of memorable meals. For years we rented the small Periwinkle Cottage on the north end from the Workman and Easley families, and were surprised to read in the 1920s and 30s that the Periwinkle Tea Room was located in the same building. After we bought our own home in 1978 with the invaluable help of Pawleys Island Realty, we had to find a name. We finally settled on lagniappe, a New Orleans word that means a little something extra or means a special gift. Over and over, we think about the Roberts coming to Pawleys Island, first as vacationers, like so many, and vacationers as well as residents of Pawleys Island wanted access to the history. And Arcadia Publishing, based in Charleston but operating across the United States, had an idea. They had an idea. They called Town Hall several years ago. Mayor Bill Otis graciously had them contact me, but the timing wasn't right, and so I declined at that time. Arcadia Publishing later contacted Steve Roberts, the former New York Times journalist who for 25 years covered Washington, D.C., for 7 more years wrote for the U.S. News and World Report, and a syndicated columnist, a commentator, and guest host on both NPR and ABC television. Steve is also a professor at George Washington University. Married to Cokie Roberts for over 50 years, their partnership was the stuff dreams are made of. Most of you know that Cokie Roberts died, as you just said, from a return of breast cancer. Her death shocked the nation and those familiar with her life's work as a journalist, in print, on television, or on radio. Her weekly radio commentaries were live, and we know were sometimes done remotely, not in Washington, but done from Pawleys Island. How do we know? Because careful listeners could hear the cry of seagulls in the background and the thump of a chair on a Pawleys porch as she broadcast from their home on the north end of Pawleys Island. A book by Cokie and Steve Roberts, From This Day Forward, tells of the courtship and the marriage they shared. Steve was from New Jersey and Cokie from New Orleans. Steve of Jewish faith, Cokie an active member of the Catholic Church. Married in Bethesda, Maryland in 1966. You knew that. 1966, looking at this picture. With the wedding at her parents' home, they said their vows underneath an apple tree. Her parents' home, of course, her parents, her father, former U.S. Senator Hale Boggs, her mother, Lindy Boggs, taking over when Hale Boggs was killed in a plane crash. 1,500 people attended their wedding, and Cokie always liked to remind people that her mother cooked for all of them. She did the reception food. Cokie and Steve's separate careers still allowed time for joint appearances. She won an Emmy. She was also named by the Library of Congress. Congress is one of America's great individuals. She was a board member and an officer many times of Save the Children, that worldwide organization. Steve also did fine work while they raised 2 children and had 6 grandchildren. And when they bought a house on the north end of Pawleys, in 2007, they named it lagniappe, that French word for something extra. And as members of the community now, they had more time to share with Pawleys Island. Cokie gave her time to speak at fundraisers, first for Miss Ruby's kids. After the other coffee table book was published, people said, "You know Cokie?" And I'm like, "Well, a little bit. Would you call and ask her if she'd be a speaker?" And I was on the board of Miss Ruby's kids, and so I got her email, and I emailed her, and she gave me her phone number, and we began to discuss her speaking first at Miss Ruby's kids. About a year later at the Pawleys Island Child Care Center, located at Parkersville, when they too needed to do a fundraiser, Parkersville at Pawleys Island. She also spoke for the United Way volunteers at the annual banquet in volunteers' honor. And then the year of the Front Street fire, they opened their oceanfront home for a fundraiser for the rebuilding of Front Street, and hundreds came to see their house, to see them, and to do something good for the city of Georgetown. Back in Bethesda, Steve Roberts was busy creating a pictorial history of Bethesda and Chevy Chase, Maryland, where he and Cokie made their home just outside D.C. Arcadia Publishing released Steve's book, and then they said, "Hey, we still need a book like this on Pawleys Island. We've been trying to get one." And so Steve contacted me, blessedly so, and it was our association through the Century book, also with Caroline Easley, Allday's ancestor, on the cover. I didn't know if Caroline might be here today. Many of you know Caroline Allday, who attends, and her ancestor on the cover of the book. One of the things that was exciting about doing that book together when it came out in Christmas time, 2008, it came out, and we were excited, but it was also $69. The book by Arcadia Publishing was usually about $20, and more accessible a history to those annual vacationers, to residents who weren't ready to invest a heftier sum. So delighted, I told Steve Roberts I'd be honored to work with him. And knowing we wanted previously unpublished photographs, we enlisted the help of your Georgetown County digital archivist, Julie Warren. And Julie had assisted me on this Pawleys Island Century book, and because she is a historian, because she is a former museum interpreter, she also understood our desire to tell a story with each photograph that Steve and I might find in the county's various archived collections, and those new photos of art that I might find through my local associations. And so it began, discovering photographs that had not been published in this book, but might be available through the county library. 1902, swimming was called bathing, and some of us still say bathing suits, put on your bathing suit, admit it. Some of y'all say it, right? I do. Typical swim garb of the first decade of the 20th century meant women wore dresses. Short dresses, but dresses, and caps, and even shoes. The men showed little skin at this time. These early life jackets, in addition to the dresses, certainly killed the notion of any sexy swimsuits that you might see today. Also in 1902, the newspaper, the Sunday Outlook, said, "There are no finer fishing grounds to be found anywhere. With perseverance and stickability," remember that word, stickability. Who needs perseverance when you got stickability? "You can catch all the fish you want." In 1968, Selena McGregor Vaughn writes in Pawleys, as it was, fresh seafood was not always available inland or upstate South Carolina due to a lack of refrigeration. So at Pawleys Island, fish was plentiful and came daily thanks to commercial fishermen. Note there's one white man, but then others who were black, and routinely seine nets and men in rowboats went out and brought fish in and sold it right on the beach. Some of the earliest photographs, like this one of a telephone company employee retreat, are from the library's collection, the Morgan Trenum collection, as Mayor Morgan sought to catalog Georgetown city and county services, buildings, and activities. This employee retreat is a reminder that by 1900, many beach houses on Pawleys were used by others beyond just families. In our Pawleys Island book, we share that we The building that we now call the Pelican Inn had been bought by the Atlantic Coast Lumber Company for use by executives, and the lumber company built other houses on the island and bought other houses for use by their employees right down the ladder. Most of the rice planters' former homes were being adapted. Rice cultivation and rice milling, as many of you know, ended in 1911. The last crop of rice milled in 1911. And this beautiful brick chimney of a former mill at William Alston's Fairfield plantation at what we now call Arcadia is synonymous with the end of rice cultivation. All of you should know, and I think you do, that Georgetown County grew more rice than any other place in the world except the area around Calcutta, India. And when you go to Charleston, you'll hear the docents say, Charleston exported more rice than any other place in the world except Calcutta, India. And I had grown students who put their hands on their hips and said, Lee said. But what do we say differently? Charleston was exporting it. Georgetown County was growing it. The last crop milled in this area in 1910. And yet, as much as the economy changed for Georgetown County, much stayed the same, socially and culturally. Former slaves and their descendants continued to live on former rice plantations in the county and on the Waccamaw Neck, and seen here on Sandy Island. Some of you may even recognize this site. It is the exact location of the boat landing today. If you've been on one of my trips to Sandy Island to eat and take a tour with Laura Harriet, you've disembarked from a boat at this location, climbed that same hill, walked past these same trees, and likely met descendants of these children on Sandy Island. When rice failed, Yankees swooped in. The second northern invasion, George Rogers calls it in his history of Georgetown County. We've been experiencing a third northern invasion since Hurricane Hugo. But that's not always a bad thing, is it? We get volunteers at Hobcaw Barony, volunteers at the Georgetown Library, at the hospitals, at hospice, at Red Cross, at Habitat. But in 1905, Bernard Baruch was the very first to buy a plantation in this area. He bought 11 plantations and reformed Hobcaw Barony, that colonial land grant. It was here that he entertained Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt. Bernard Baruch's cousin was a cousin to the Kaminskis. Bernard Baruch employed hundreds on the property. And he, like others that followed, would contribute a great deal to the local economy. And it was his daughter, Belle Baruch, who by 1956 had purchased all of Hobcaw Barony. And it was Belle Baruch who in 1964 created today's privately owned Research Reserve and created what you know as the Belle Baruch Foundation. And access through 13 public tours a week and a wide variety of programs is available through our public education program at the Discovery Center, but the land is protected in perpetuity. 16,000 acres purchased by a New Yorker in 1905. At a lecture later at Hobcaw Barony, we'll talk about how he was born in South Carolina, he moved to New York City when he was 10, and then he came back. But he is thought of as a Northerner, and he also was the first Northerner in 1905. In 1906, Captain Isaac Emerson of Baltimore purchased 7 plantations and renamed his holding directly north of Hobcaw, Arcadia. A native of North Carolina, but a Baltimore millionaire, he is known as the Bromo Seltzer King. Emerson restored this 18th century house and its formal gardens. He added a stable made of the brick ruins of plantation buildings. He built a gymnasium and barns, tennis courts, and a bowling alley. His grandson, George Vanderbilt, inherited Arcadia, and George Vanderbilt's grandson lives and manages Arcadia today. In late January, Hobcaw Barony will lead a program featuring a tour of the grounds and a lecture by the author of a brand new biography to come out in January. A brand new biography of Isaac Emerson, January 30th, entitled The Bromo Seltzer King. The land at Arcadia has been subdivided over the years. Debidu was created out of Arcadia about 1970. Prince George River, Prince George Ocean was developed in the 1990s, and some of the property today recently developed directly across from Hog Heaven. Anybody live across from Hog Heaven? There's some new houses there. We got tickled the other day. Somebody said, well, where does Pawleys Island start and where does Pawleys Island end? And he said, from Hog Heaven to Moe's Barbecue. You know you're in the South. The boundaries are set by barbecue joints, right? So, yeah, I just love that. And it was a Northerner who said it, so I can quote him, yeah. We know that development from Arcadia was created, but still over 7,000 acres of Arcadia is preserved in perpetuity through conservation easements. Before the Huntingtons purchased Brook Green, the rice planting families had sold and resold, and one had built a post-Civil War main house. This structure built right after the Civil War. And then in 1930, the Huntingtons of New York purchased Brook Green and 3 adjoining plantations, dismantled this structure, and created and opened in 1931 the beautiful gardens that you know that have been expanded over and over since 1931. Brook Green opened to the public. There are 9,000 acres at Brook Green and Huntington Beach State Park protected in perpetuity. And so as the county's plantations began to change, the face of the island changed too. A short railway ran across the Waccamaw from the former Hagley plantation at Hagley Landing. Many of you have been to Key West and gone to one particular place to watch the sunset. Well, I'm just telling you, almost as many people gather at Hagley Landing today to watch the sunset. So I'm just telling you, if you live on the Waccamaw Neck, now you know where the party is. At Hagley Landing. And so many people that gather at that spot don't realize that this train ran from Hagley Landing all the way down what we think of as Hagley Road, across the South Causeway to Pawleys Island. A railroad from about 1901 to 1906, the Georgetown Pawleys Island Railway, was a result of the Atlantic Coast Lumber Company wanting to create that employee retreat on Pawleys Island, and the train was primarily for ACL employees traveling for day trips. Imagine the company's belief that if we create an employee retreat and provide transportation, daily transportation, we can get our employees back to work on Monday morning without too much concern. The train's tracks ran alongside the dirt road and alongside the South Causeway. The pre-Civil War causeway, 1854, the operation of the train also are covered in the book by Arcadia Publishing. And why was the train discontinued as early as 1906? A major hurricane that destroyed the landing, destroyed the tracks. Whenever we mark time in America, often we do it by the Revolutionary War, by the Civil War, by World War I and World War II. When you live at the beach, you mark time by this hurricane, that hurricane, this hurricane. So in 1906, yet another hurricane. Prior to 1935, there was no bridge from the Waccamaw Neck to Georgetown, no bridge to the mainland. And throughout the county, ferries were important for crossing the 5 rivers that flow into Winyah Bay. By 1928, a larger and more regular ferry operated from the east end, the bay side of Front Street, across to about where the bridges are located today. On-demand ferries, like the one in this photo, became known by the operator most often. In our county, we have Brown's Ferry and Pringle's Ferry. Yesterday, I drove from Columbia State Fair down Garner's Ferry Road until I reached the Wateree River, where Mr. Garner operated a ferry. If you've been from here to Berkeley County, you've crossed where Lanude's Ferry once took Revolutionary War soldiers and Francis Marion across. An exception, the South Island Ferry, not named for the ferry owner, ferry operator, but simply South Island Ferry that crosses the Intracoastal Waterway to go where? To the Yawkey Wildlife Center. 24,000 acres owned by Detroit/Bostonian. 24,000 acres protected in perpetuity. Ferries, very important in an area dominated by water. And roads on the Waccamaw were dirt. They were narrow, they were dark, and in some cases they were perilous. I love this photo of an old storm-broken cypress and a car from the 1920s as it heads north toward Pawleys Island. I enjoyed interviewing some of the last ferry riders to Pawleys Island, Mac and Nancy Boyle, Frank Marlowe and Doc Lashcott, and even Sister Peterkin, who had a story about a preacher crossing on a Waccamaw ferry. Because there was a fee to ride the ferry, a minister once asked the ferryman, took his hat off, held it to his chest, and said, "How much, sir, do you charge a man of the cloth?" And the response, the ferryman said, "Well, sir, not 1 penny more than anybody else." To ride a ferry, to travel these narrow roads to Pawleys Island, meant we really wanted to go to Pawleys Island. This evocative photograph from the 1920s of two girls cooling off was considered by Arcadia Publishing to be the cover of the book. Although Julie and I had already decided on the cover photograph of the book, you just see a photograph and you know you want it. The publishers thought this would be the one. Well, if you look closely, what's wrong?
It's the Waccamaw.
Absolutely. That's the Waccamaw River. We believe it's right there at the Hagley Landing. They also wanted to use the photograph of the black children on Sandy Island. And with the words Pawleys Island right over it, that wouldn't do for me and for our readers so familiar with Pawleys. And yet we love this photograph, and it's also in the book. Think about this photo submitted, especially as we wrote about the Waccamaw Neck, included information about the plantations, about the roads, about the ferries. It was important for us not just to limit this small book to the island itself, but the community that we call Pawleys, and really how that community was created. And so, as we cross the Waccamaw Neck and head to the North Causeway, built in the early 20th century, 1904, as we cross over to the island and look back to the west, look back to the mainland, we see houses built about that time, 1904, as rentals. Pawleys has rarely been only a few summer residences. Quickly, particularly after the Civil War and by the early 20th century, paying guests. Note that euphemism. Not customers, not clients, paying guests. Inns were created, employee retreats, and these tenements, these houses built specifically to be rentals, called the Lashcott Subdivision, provided accommodation, crude accommodations, but for families and for fishermen. Basic accommodations on the mainland, on the creek side, today between Walgreens, Child Blossom, and the creek. Does that help? The Lashcotts, from 1790, they came to the country. They worked and lived in Charleston, primarily as mill managers, as engineers, first in Charleston and then in Georgetown County. The Lashcott family were not rice planters and large-scale slave owners. Instead, they were rice mill operators. They didn't own large numbers of slaves and property, so they were perfectly positioned at the close of the American Civil War to purchase properties as they came available as rice planters failed in the late 19th and early 20th century. The entrepreneurship of the Lashcotts also meant that they created rice plantations, rice conglomerates until about 1910, but they formed partnerships to do this for production and for milling. But they also created boat yards for repairs, barrel factories, a dairy, a store, a post office, as well as those rental units and inns on the island. Doc Lashcott, a direct descendant of the 1790 Lashcotts, owned and operated Litchfield Realty, the hammock shops, also landscaping and land development. He and his wife still live in the vicinity of this photograph, creekside of the hammock shops. In those early years of summer retreats, there was no water and sewer, but an artesian well was located not far from where the South Causeway ends on the island. And I love this photograph taken about 1925 of Mac Boyle escaping his mother's bath. Mac would become mayor in the 1990s for a brief period of time. By the 1930s and 40s, inns had been well established on the island by more families like the Lashcotts Captain Boo Lashcott created Boo's Inn. He and his wife Lucille ran it for years. The extended family of the Boyles, Daisy McGregor, created Newcastle Inn. Tip Top Inn was operated by a family known as the Dingles. Mr. Dingle, a former manager at Arcadia Plantation. The Brinkley Inn, as you see on the sign, a forerunner of what would be renamed Casina Inn. And the Tavern, first that 19th century pre-Civil War home, then Boo's Inn, Captain Boo Lashcott, then operated by the Ellerby family of Marion, South Carolina. This sign stood not far from the last Pawleys Island Pavilion near the North Causeway, near Town Hall. And I like to tease Julie Warren. When I first showed her this picture, I told her, look, Donny Osmond used to vacation here. Am I wrong? Do you see Donny? Don't you see? Don't you? I was surprised Julie Warren knew who Donny Osmond was. She's so young. One of my favorite photographs, taken just before 1935, because it is the old Lashcott store, which also held the post office. It appears in an old building located again between the Chai Blossom restaurant, Walgreens, Chai Blossom, and the North Causeway. When I first moved here, I was so literal. When somebody said, probably Faye Marlowe said, the old Lashcott store stood on the North Causeway. I said, well, there's not much room. How could it stand on the North Causeway? But from what you think of as Highway 17 all the way across the creek is the North Causeway. So this store stood in the trees between Chai Blossom Restaurant and the water itself. This store also was relocated to Highway 17 just after US 17 was paved, just after the bridge was built in what year for the first time to Georgetown? Go ahead, Ellen. 1935, a date you will not forget, because every time I'm with you, I will make you remember that date. No matter where you're from, a bridge changes the culture, a bridge changes the economy. 1935, US 17 connected New York and Miami, connected it for fast, easy thoroughfares. Yesterday when we stopped in Manning to eat supper at Shoney's, I think it's the last Shoney's open in America. I'm at the salad bar and I meet a woman who said, what's that? I said, those are collards. And I said, where are you from? And she said, well, we live in New York and we spend our winters in Florida. And of course, right up what highway now? I-95. Manning sits right there and captures that New York to Miami crowd to this day, to this day. I like this photograph also because it reminds us that the post office was inside the store, and even when the store moved up to the corner, that the post office still was inside. Located right on that paved road, capturing customers there. And one of my favorite maps calls US 17 the road to romance. Next time you go on US 17 instead of I-95, just think about that as you argue with your spouse about taking the less traveled road. It's the road to romance. In 1936, a lot of changes in this area. The port of Georgetown increased traffic because of international paper. 1936, IP was built. Lumber and paper for World War II boosted the economy, and more year-rounders chose Pawleys Island after World War II and into the 1950s. All Saints Episcopal Church, it was one of the oldest churches and one of the only churches available in the white community. All Saints, prior to the Civil War, had established 13 slave chapels up and down the Waccamaw Neck. Independent of the white All Saints, there were AME churches and Baptist churches used by the African American community. But All Saints was a religious, cultural, and social center for a long time. It wasn't until 1947 there was a Presbyterian church, and a couple of years later a Baptist church. Catholic church? Not in South Carolina. Woo! South Carolina was open to all as a colony. Jews, we had the largest Jewish population in the nation until the 1820s. No Catholics. Look up your colonial history or come to another lecture. And of course, if you are Catholic, you know even in America, Catholics were persecuted for so long. Do we have a Catholic church on the Waccamaw Neck today? Do we have a Catholic church in Georgetown today? Yes, because of newcomers. Because of newcomers, St. Mary's grew. Because of newcomers, Precious Blood grew. Also in 1947, a little church elsewhere was created, moved from elsewhere in the county, offered for the use on the island. And between Memorial Day and Labor Day, services are held in this Pawleys Island House of Worship. Its proper name, Pawleys Island Chapel and the Creek Chapel, its nicknames. This small church was wanted by the men who were looking after Pawleys Island's well-being, with the pavilion and all that drinking and all that driving and all that beach music and all that dancing and all those young people, all those bikinis. We needed a church. And so during the summer, especially for that summer clientele, this small chapel was moved to Pawleys Island, built on stilts out over the marsh, and to this day it still serves as a place for worship, for weddings. My husband and I were married there, the first couple after Hurricane Hugo to be married. As we walked in for the rehearsal, the electrician was backing out, doing his last repairs. So many people remember weddings, and also there have been funerals, memorial services, baptisms of those little children. We used, when we baptized our children, we used holy water. Holy water from where? The creek at Pawleys Island. This church has been especially meaningful to so many people. And speaking of religion, men religiously raided the nest of sea turtles on Pawleys Island for centuries, until sea turtles' numbers dwindled and laws were passed for protection. Here, about 1925, friends, including Edwin Kaminsky on the far right, showed us how to suck eggs. Turtle eggs are not only delicious and cooked over campfires on the beach. For many years, they were shipped to major cities like New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C. Also sold, even in recent years, as pickled eggs in bars. One of the reasons that turtle eggs were so popular, perhaps you know this already, turtle eggs were believed to be aphrodisiacs, making them very popular. Several years ago, when we started the Winyah Bay Heritage Festival, my great job was to have on stage 5 former African-American duck hunting guides. And then during that repartee with the microphone and back and forth answering questions in front of a huge audience, they started talking about holding big burlap sacks underneath the sea turtles and capturing the eggs for selling them, for using them. And I don't know what got into me, but when you're on the stage with a microphone, you go a little crazy, and I said, let me ask a question. Is it true that sea turtle eggs are considered aphrodisiacs? And I put the microphone at one of the most talkative men there, and he looked at the other men, the 5 of them looked at each other with a funny little look on their face. And then I was waiting for that answer, and I'm glad I waited for it, because he said, who needs aphrodisiacs? I decided I better do something else at the festival the next year. Other pursuits have only changed slightly. The men in the fish boats, as we mentioned briefly before, went out daily from the shore in rowboats and on foot with seine nets. Their catch was literally unloaded on the beach, and cooks, African-American cooks that worked for families as well as individuals, came and bought fish cheap and buying the bucketful, most importantly, fresh fish. The pursuit of surfing started early. Here, before 1920, a man named Swanson, that's all we know, rides an early version of a surfboard, a piece of cypress with a rope attached. After the Pawleys Island, A Century of History and Photographs was published, so about 2009, we got a call from a man whose name escapes me. A man called Julie here at the library and said, I understand you've got a very early picture of surfing, and I'm writing a book on early surfing and what was done in South Carolina as well as Hawaii, and is contributing to. His book has since been published, I believe, with this photograph, and it's exciting to think that surfing still is one of the most popular pursuits at Pawleys Island. This simple piece of cypress with a rope attached afforded a great deal of fun riding the waves at Pawleys. The pursuit of porch sitting has not changed. Hammocks, swings, rocking chairs, talking, jawing, courting, A good porch sit is still valued by so many people. Families continued coming for generations, and at Cypress Cottage, which stood at access number 1 on the north end until Hugo, the Barnetts, the Morrises, and the O'Briens from Columbia enjoyed huge family gatherings. I knew some of the youngest in the photograph, as I too had lived in Columbia. John O'Brien, I saw at church on Sunday. It donated so many photographs for scanning and for reuse to Julie Warren here for the Georgetown County Digital Library. Has been generous, not only for this publication, but for the digital library itself. Hurricane Hazel in 1954 brought major change to the island. Many families lost their homes, but the oldest houses from the 19th century stood for the most part. The surprise, or is it really, houses and the pier were immediately rebuilt. If your house washed across the salt marsh and was resting on the mainland, ropes and chains and a come-along pulled your house right back to the island where it could be placed on new and higher pilings after Hurricane Hazel. The new pier, rebuilt by the 1955 season, both the 1954 and the 1955 pier had a grand opening ceremony, and Georgetown native and today resident Connie Bull of Georgetown was the ribbon cutter both times. Connie has also shared many of her Eric family photos from their home, Liberty Lodge. The pier was always private. I want to say that. It provided public access, but the pier was always private. Hobcob Barony is private, and we provide public access, right, through guided tours and programs. The pier was built as a private venture, and the public could walk out for free, and if you went fishing, it was about how much? 25 cents, 50 cents. It was an inexpensive cost to go fishing. There was a shop at the end that served short order. There were a little gift shop there, and it was accessible to the public, but it was a private venture. Staff person ran it. Sometimes when people talk about the good old days, they talk about the condominiums that were built at the foot of the pier, and the pier remains private and accessible today only to those guests at the condominiums, the owners and renters at the Pawleys Island condominiums. But as often as we say, I wish we could keep Pawleys as it was, what year would you pick? Would you pick the year that we had 2 or 3 mobile home parks on the island? Notice the mobile home in the photograph? Sometimes things do get better, don't they? Some people would talk about horticulture and yards and the appearance of houses. Both with the pavilion and the pier, people that owned older houses to the north and south talked about how much trash was in the vicinity between the old pavilions and the fishing pier. So I'm just presenting the other side of the story for those who remember when the pier was publicly accessible. It's an interesting time. 1955, the pier was rebuilt. It's been rebuilt many times, especially right after Hurricane Hugo, and then repaired after Hurricane Matthew.
Well, you have to mention that that's why they're known as the condominiums.
Could y'all hear D. Piers? When the condominiums were built, it was an impetus to incorporate. The first conversations about incorporating, which was voted upon by voters on Pawleys Island, 1985. The town of Pawleys Island, which is just the island, the community of Pawleys Island includes the mainland, just the town, incorporated primarily because of the condominiums. And I'll say something else about the condominiums. The condominiums were planned and designed and financed by primarily local men, not people that came from off and decided to rape and pillage the island. It's important to think about that as we welcome newcomers, and as we see changes, great changes that I'll allude to, it's important to remember that some of the great changes were also created by people that had lived here for generations. It's hard to say that sometimes, but it's true. Also in the 1950s and 60s, commerce improved. Baby boomers, parents had cars, they needed gas, they needed groceries, and they needed hammocks. Esso gas was sold at the newer location. This is Lashcott's store, about where Pawleys Island Supplies is located on Highway 17. And I love, not too long ago when I finally went to the museum in Detroit, in Dearborn, Michigan, the Henry Ford Museum, I finally learned 2 things about gasoline. I found out how Esso got its name. Some of y'all have been knowing for decades, right? Somebody tell us, how did Esso get its name?
Eastern States Standard Oil.
Standard Oil, S-O. Raise your hand if you didn't know that. Yeah, see, Esso, Standard Oil, thank you. Also, we have an old gas pump at Hobcaw Barony that's recently been restored. It's red, it says Esso, and it has a large glass chamber at the top. And for the longest time, we were trying to figure out how old is our gas pump. And I came back from a wedding in Detroit of a slave descendant from Hobcaw just a few years ago, and I said, our gas pump cannot be any older than 1925. And they said, oh yeah? How do you know? 1925, according to the exhibit at the Henry Ford Museum, is when consumers demanded a glass chamber so that they could see how many gallons of gas they were really getting. So think about how many times there has been conversation about us getting cheated at gas pumps, particularly in the 1970s and again in the early 2000s when gas prices spiked. Anyway, numerology was off at Pawleys Island in the 2000s at the local Texaco at the corner. You know, the filling station we still call the Texaco, that we still call the Quick Stop, even though it's been 5 different things since then, right? We still do that. Excuse me, I wanted to show you something. In the background, just below the Esso sign, you might call it Frank's Restaurant to the right, but of course it was the location of Marlos Supermarket, according to their sign. Marlos Store, no E, Marlos Store. Those 2 grocery stores ran side by side. They both sold innumerable types of things beyond groceries, but Lashcott's grocery store and then Marlos grocery store. Lashcott's had an apostrophe S, Marlos had an apostrophe S, and guess what else once had an apostrophe? And if you want to stay after the lecture and fight about it, I got proof now. Pawleys Island had an apostrophe. And there are only about 5% of us that still use the apostrophe, but historian. Changes again. Normal growth in the Pawleys Island area. A few new schools, a few new churches, but nothing major happened until Hurricane Hugo on September 22nd, 1989. 1989. I had been elected to Pawleys Island Town Council. I lived on the north end, and I served before and after Hugo. I was engaged at that time to the man in charge of Santee Cooper, our electricity on the Waccamaw Neck. We didn't see each other for weeks and weeks, and maybe that was for the best, you know, before the wedding comes along. We had our own source of stress. And we began to divide time, too, between people that lived here. If you moved to Pawleys Island, you weren't from here, did you live here before Hugo or after Hugo? I think that, again, like I said earlier, hurricanes become our defining point. When people were watching national television in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York, Ella Henderson, some of you know, she turned to her husband and she said, oh my gosh, look what's happening down there on the South Carolina coast. Look what Hugo's done. No electricity, alligators, snakes. Let's move there. And what happened after the national news featured places like Charleston, Georgetown, Pawleys Island, Myrtle Beach being almost, you know, according to the national news, decimated, destroyed, wiped off the map in 1989, people said, let's go live there. But after every hurricane disaster, after every major flood, you see rebuilding. A lot of it has to do with resilience, but also a lot of it has to do with insurance. Changes again to the Pawleys Island area. When we think of Pawleys Island, about 500 houses. During Hugo, about 100 were destroyed and rebuilt. Pawleys Island with its North Causeway at the bottom of the photograph, almost every inch of space has been built upon. Marsh has been filled in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s until laws in the 1980s, building on fill, houses that on the very south end of Pawleys, as y'all well know from this fall storms, are being underwashed, and the steps are rebuilt, and the creek docks are rebuilt. Again, resiliency. And some people will say over and over, Pawleys is just not the same. It's just not the same. Think of this house that's been standing since, we believe, before the Civil War. But Pawleys Island has been a constant. For those who say it's not the same, I don't even go anymore, there has been erosion and accretion. There's been the replacement of some of those, the majority of those arrogantly shabby houses with what some would call McMansions, rentals that renters require. Central air, ice makers, big screen TVs, and those rentals during portions of the year, May, June, July, August, September, pay the taxes, make owning a home a possibility. Even Steve and Cokie Roberts rent their house on Pawleys in order to afford to enjoy it other times of the year. But the 19th century houses still stand, improved and re-roofed, preserved for the future. The Pawley House, one of about 10 with the 19th century history and the historic marker. Since earlier centuries, people held Pawleys in such high regard for its salubrious retreat, the retreat from heat and malaria. Valued also, Pawleys' lack of pretension is famous. Its laid-back lifestyle is famous. Despite some changes, the majority of people who love Pawleys have returned year after year, decade after decade, century after century, because Pawleys Island is not just the houses, it's not even the people with the shared love of the Blessed Isle. It is instead a state of mind, a different place, at times esoteric. I don't see what y'all see is so great about it. I rode over there and it's just a bunch of houses, say some visitors. Esoteric. At times it is ethereal. Look at all the photographs being taken and posted on Facebook of sunrise, morning after morning, sunrises. But always this place draws one back. And in closing, to use Steve Roberts' beautiful words, but the breathing, beating heart of this place has not changed at all. Life is still lived by the rhythms of the day and of the season. The sun still rises over the ocean and sets over the creek. The pelicans still fly, the flounder still bite, the sand is still warm, and the tea is still cold. A walk on the beach is still one of life's purest pleasures. Long live Pawleys Island. Thank you. And you say any time for questions. Do we have minutes left?
Sure.
Do people have questions
Please do.
or clarifications?
Why isn't there a comma on the book?
I know. I tried, didn't I, Julie Warren? I tried. This is the accepted spelling without the apostrophe. And I believe, as a historian, I believe it started especially, we know there was an individual named Pawley. We know he had 3 sons, but even if he had 3 sons and there was an S, there should have been an apostrophe after the S. If you really wanted to eliminate the apostrophe, you would go to Pawley Island, just like the Church of St. Mary, the Church of St. Peter. By the same token, when the post office became computerized, almost nationwide, let's say in the mid-60s, computers took out apostrophes on almost everything they could. And this has become an accepted spelling. I didn't say it was correct, did I? Accepted spelling. But that's the main reason it's not on the cover of this book. We were to be complimented that it was produced in hardback. I know many of you have the paperback, and I was so disappointed. And Steve said, "This is great. A hardback is so much more meaningful." And I said, "I know, but as a hardback, it's $26.99. And as an educator, I like the idea that a $20 paperback is more accessible to the masses."
Do you recognize me, your relative?
Nice to see
It
you.
is good to
Nice to
see
see you. Good. Look at you. Look at you here today. Do you have your book in your hand?
No, ma'am.
I was gonna say. And I decided I wouldn't bring books to sell today because Waterfront Books is so close. And Sandra Quinn does so much for the library. Last week brought us David Hodges, and I love to think about, if you don't have this book yet, think about Waterfront Books here in Georgetown, and also Litchfield Books on the Waccamaw Neck. We always like to support our independent bookstores because they're so good to authors. They're so good to the libraries. They're so good to Movable Feast, which is co-sponsored by the Litchfield Bookstore and Class at Pawleys Island. Linda Ketron's idea of Movable Feast. So, hey, cuz. Yes.
What's your next book?
Oh, that's so good. Yes, you know, the author loves that. In fact, we are hard at work on a book that is also large format. I'm working with a specific individual, and we like to think that it'll be about this size. This book was published by Evening Post Publications and Joggling Board Press. They briefly merged to share talents. And so I haven't decided on a publisher, and I never talk to a publisher until I finish the book. That's a lot less pressure. But what Julie Warren and I are working on is a book this size, this similar, with historic photographs of Hobcob Barony. And I hope to finish it in 2020 and then have it in your hands by 2021. You'll be old enough to get it that year, 2021. Does that help you remember? So don't be calling me in 2020 saying you got that book yet. But we think it's time. It'll primarily be black and white. We'll make some decisions. But Julie has always been a great help with so many people's books. Julie's standing in the back. If you're wondering, who am I talking about? Look at Julie in the green. Woo-hoo! Julie came to the area from Monticello, from Colonial Williamsburg, from her native Virginia, to work at Hampton Plantation. But in 2007, she came to work and to really begin our Georgetown County Digital Library since 2007. Julie has worked so much. She's in the acknowledgments of other authors' books. She's in the acknowledgments of our previous books. And it's not until this year when I twisted her arm and made her say she would let me put her name on the book with mine. She agreed, and then I agreed to let her help me. So that's the next book, Hobcob Barony, Historic Photographs, Lee and Julie Warren. So, yes, Dee.
Lee, when you were showing your slides, I thought I saw a book, 15 postcards.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, the second slide, I meant to say that and I didn't. The photographs in the book, the publishers decided to pick out some of their favorites, I guess about 15, and we sell little packs of postcards as well as the book. So when you go to a bookstore or book signing and you can't quite afford the $27 book, you can buy a pack of $7 postcards, whether you mail them out or not. But I found at book signings, most people want the book, and nobody's writing cards anymore, are they? I think it's Facebook and text and Twitter, but I think it's important sometimes. You know, a postcard, it only takes one sentence to say, hey, thinking of you. And a postcard doesn't have to be sent from Pawleys. It can be sent to someone who loves Pawleys. So the postcard, little packs of postcards are available, as is the book. Thank you. And the Arcadia Publishing likes to do that sometimes when they think it's an area with high tourism, like Pawleys Island. Bob, thank you for an audience. Thank you for an opportunity.